hopefully we can get the same crew we had. I don't want to wear them all out too much, but but we'll probably have to go over and do some work over to get some of his trees out of the way. But I'll let you know for sure as soon as I find out.
Thanks, Paul. If you know where Bobby lives, there's a lot of trees around there. So we sure appreciate that, Paul, for the benevolence work that Paul leads us with and the opportunities we have to serve. Appreciate everybody who finds those opportunities and gives us those opportunities to serve. We are having some difficulties this morning with, we've got some internet issues. Won't be able to have PowerPoint this morning, but fortunately, we do have enough internet to get the video. So that's the important part, huh? So we'll get the video, Dr. Manor. We're thinking it will work. Think it's good? Okay. Our IT guy, Ryan's back there on top of it. So you may get through all the other issues. So we're going to, Dr. Manor, we're going to be talking about, Paul's going to move from Athens to Corinth. And it'll be a really interesting transition. Remember in Athens, you know, the Mars Hill discussion we talked about and how they just weren't that receptive and the different type of people he was dealing with. And so Paul's going to leave and go to Athens. Dr. Manor is going to talk to us about a little bit of the geography about going from Athens to Corinth. And then we'll get into the text after that. So Ryan, if you would, go ahead and play that video.
Paul's success of ministry in Athens was less than stellar. The intellectuals apparently rejected his message. There was some success, there were some converts, but Paul makes his way then to the city of Corinth. The Bible narrates, after these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Typical mode of Paul's operation: go to the synagogue, work with the synagogue first. But the transition from Athens to Corinth geographically is a rather interesting one. As we look at the map here, you'll see where Athens is, and then there's this little narrow band of land that connects Athens section to where Corinth is. This is an isthmus, and this becomes sort of a significant focal point in the ancient world from the standpoint of trade and geography. The photograph here is an aerial view of this isthmus, and you'll see a straight line cut across it, which is a canal that was built in the 1890s AD. And in the ancient world, this isthmus became a very important element of trade connections. There was thoughts of building a canal in antiquity. They never really got around to it, but alternatively, they had a paved road that went from one side to the other. Now, the isthmus itself is about 3.5 miles. But because of the tumultuous waters around the Peloponnese Peninsula, the people in antiquity found it more expedient economically and politically to stop at Corinth, remove their goods from one side, perhaps even the boat itself, and transport the goods to the other side on this pavement called the Diolkos. Here's a photograph of my wife standing on the remnants of the Diolkos that was found, I think, in the 1950s. And you can see how thick that pavement is. And they would take the goods from one side to the other side and sometimes even remove the boat and put it on a barge, a wagon of sorts, and carry it across and relaunch it on the other side. And because of this trade connection, Corinth became a significant economic hub. And you can easily imagine sailors, finding their leave, going into the city of Corinth. And this all is going to contribute to so much of what Paul talks about in the Corinthian correspondence. Strabo, in his geography, talks about several reasons why Corinth becomes so wealthy in the ancient world. One of those has to do with the trade connections through the Diolkos that we just talked about. But the second one is the presence of the Isthmian Games. Now, most of us are aware of the Olympics, of course. Those occur every 4 years. The Isthmian Games was another one of those pan-Hellenic And by that we mean all of Greece kind of participation. But these occurred every 2 years. And Paul is there at one of those occasions when the Isthmian Games take place. The site of Isthmia is about 5 miles from Corinth, but Corinth is sort of the administrative hub. There's even an office at Corinth dealing with the Isthmian Games. And as Paul is there, one of these seasons of games takes place. So you have this huge influx of people. Think in terms of the Super Bowl and people coming together for all of the activity associated with the Super Bowl and the restaurants and places to stay and all of that kind of thing. Here is a view of part of the running, part of the track at Isthmia. And I'm standing in the starting pit. And this is a really interesting kind of setup. And I'm standing there holding these strings. And in the scenario, the strings attached to a gateway that as the person stands in the middle holding all the strings, and at the go, he lets go of all of these strings and the gates all drop at the same time. So this is their starting gate. I mean, it's really rather ingenious kind of physics and technology associated with the qualification for running the games. But Paul is there for certainly a significant reason otherwise. He's there for the gospel. And because he is a tent maker, he associates with Priscilla and Aquila. And the photograph we're looking at here is what is left of one of these types of shops with which Paul and Priscilla and Aquila would be associated. And I can easily imagine Paul standing out in front of the shop talking about, do you need a tent repair? Do you need to buy a tent? And part of this would be the sailors on leave. Part of it would be the people coming to the Isthmian Games, needing some shelter from the sun and the elements and so forth. But Paul's emphasis is not merely upon physical structure. I find it interesting in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul says, "For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house," and the allusion is to this tent, "we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven." Paul can turn these things into something spiritually significant. And Corinth becomes the focus of some of his ministry for about a year and a half.
Some interesting archaeology there for Corinth, which kind of will come into, will be interesting for us to look at as we look at the text. And even as you read into 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and I hope some of this background as we study Acts. Ryan, you got the PowerPoint up, huh? Good. Thank you very much. Great to have those IT guys help out with that. So hopefully our study in the history in Acts, when you read the books, and we talked about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which he'll actually write here from Corinth, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Timothy will come to Corinth. Paul's going to write these letters, and they deliver the letters because he'll send Timothy back with the letter to the church at Thessalonica. And so he'll do that later on in the 3rd missionary journey. He's going to write back to Corinth, which he'll be here at Corinth for about a year and a half. So some interesting things as you kind of understand what happened while he was there, the reasons he writes back to them, and even some of the history of like these games and some of the references Paul makes to athletic enterprises is because he's here during a time. It would come to Corinth every 2 years. These Isthmian Games would come every 2 years. It would come to Corinth. And so it was during the period of time where the games were going to be there that Paul's stay actually coincides with that, as most scholars believe. So that would give rise to why he would talk that. So do not fear. We're going to talk about that in this session today. Chronology of Acts. And I apologize. I'm having some allergy issues this morning. Chronology of Acts, we're about 51 to 53 AD is during the time of this 2nd missionary journey, during the reign of Claudius, which we'll mention Claudius today, who is the emperor at this time. And so here's our map. Remember, we're here way on the left side. He's come through, remember the Macedonian call. Remember, Macedonia is a province, so it's not a city. So when you read the Bible about Macedonia, it's a province. We're going to read about Achaia, which you see Achaia is not a city, it's a province. And Achaia is where Corinth is. And Corinth is basically the capital of the province of Achaia. So it's a very important city. So when you read those names, Achaia, Macedonia, remember it's not cities. It's just a province, and there's other cities that are in there. So that's helpful, I think, as we study and look at that. Any thoughts or comments from the video that struck you, that came to mind? Anything that might have caught from that? If not, you can add it later. So let's look at our text today. First, just start with the first verse. We've already talked about it. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. Now, how long did Paul stay in Athens? Let me ask a question. How long did Paul stay in Athens? And I guess maybe it's a trick question. Do we really know? No, he didn't stay in Athens 2 years. Well, Corinth, he's going to stay 1.5 years. But probably a trick question, Paul. Really don't know. But he stayed there a short time. He didn't stay there long. And he leaves and goes to Corinth. What would be indications of why he didn't stay there very long, you think? They weren't very receptive. Yeah, they weren't very receptive. And we're going to have some things we're going to read in the text today that may give us some more indications of that reason too. So they were not that receptive. And so Paul leaves. He doesn't stay there very long, but he will stay in Corinth for 1.5 years. It's probably about the longest he stays at any one city on his second journey. But he will be back through Athens later. So that's what most scholars think. But let's look at the comparison between these two cities and see what Paul leaves and what he's going into. So some think he might have gone from the pit to the fire, because it's not like he's going to a city that's going to be that you would think, and I should pose it that way. He's not going into a city that you would think would be that much more receptive than Athens. Of course, we know the philosophical things we talked about with Athens, but Corinth had a measure of that too. So let's just kind of look at the difference in the Athenians and the Corinthians as we get into where Paul's at in Corinth. Athens was a university town, which we talked about. Corinth is a commercial center. It's very much a commercial center. And so there would be a high population of Jews in Corinth, which there weren't many in Athens. We talked about that. That was another thing. But there'd be a high population of Jews in Corinth because there's a lot of trade that went on there. So it was a smelting pot of a lot of people. Now you can read a difference in population numbers from anywhere from 125,000 up to 300,000. So the population of Corinth, it's a lot larger city than Athens was at the time. But anyway, the population ranges in that area. So it's a thriving commercial city for sure. The Athenians were intrigued with intellect. The Corinthians were fascinated with the flesh. It was said that you could go to Corinth to have a good time. That's the kind of character the city had, because it was all about the flesh. Towering over the city was the temple of Aphrodite, who was the so-called goddess of love, who Rome called Venus. So that was their essence. That was the essence of the city. It was all about flesh. It was all about the carnal things and fleshly nature. So they were fascinated with that. Another thing, Athenians claimed to search for truth, but Corinth, they were unashamedly pursued pleasure. They didn't apologize for it. That was what they would thrive for. Yeah, Alex. Great point. Yeah, great point. just what you may know about the Corinthian letter. You think about all the issues Paul has to deal with the flesh, and it's because of this environment they lived in. Great point, Alex. Appreciate that, but that's very true. And some wealth, Corinth was a city of great wealth, and a lot of the wealth came from the Isthmian Games, because as Dr. Manor referred to, people would travel in and would bring many visitors to the area, and they would pay to stay in the inns or wherever they might stay, and they would spend money. So that created a lot of their wealth as well. So this is the type city that Paul's going to come into. Capital of the Roman province, I mentioned, of Achaia. So it's a thriving city that Corinth is going to come into. Any other thoughts or comments on that, Paul? Las Vegas, yeah, probably good. What we call Las Vegas, Sin City. It's got its own name, doesn't it? So yeah, probably similar to that idea. You know what that city represents anyway, you know, and that's Corinth had that kind of a characterization about it. Thought there was even one other characterization I thought, but yeah, that really sums it up. So let's look at the continue with our text, see what occurs. So it's good to know kind of the background. That lets us know what Paul has to deal with, the type of people he's going to be dealing with, and particularly, like Alex mentioned, gives us a better idea when he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians, some of the issues they're having to deal with. These Christians are going to have to come out of that. As they're converted, they're going to have to come out of these influences that are around them, which are these fleshly influences that they're going to have to be able to come out of. And Paul's always going to have a concern for that. Acts 18, 2-4. And he found a Jew named Aquila, referring to Paul, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, remember we talked about Claudius, the emperor, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So we're going to find that Paul's going to get acquainted with Aquila and Priscilla because they've left Rome, and which Rome was on the far left of actually wasn't in our slide, but it's on the far left, quite a ways from Corinth. But they had traveled from Rome to Corinth, probably because of their trade. It's going to be mentioned here, a good place for them to go practice their trade. But they are part of the Jews who had left Rome. A lot of different discussion as to why why Jews left Rome, and there's some that even secular writer Suetonius writes in a writing that he writes about the life of Claudius. He makes reference to his exile of the Jews by saying they were indulging in constant riots at the instigation of Christus, which they assume meant Christ. So in Suetonius, who's a secular writer, writes about Claudius, he says he exiled the Jews because they're always arguing and rioting over this Christus. So in that time, Rome thought the Jews and the Christianity was just a sect of the Jews. So that was an argument between the two. It was a Jewish argument. And we're going to see that later in this chapter where there's a leader, a Roman leader who's going to say, you settle this yourself. It's not a Roman argument. This is a Jewish argument later in the chapter 18, later in this chapter. So Claudius decides, I'm tired of your rioting and your bickering. I want you all gone. And so the Jews have to leave Rome, which would also include any Jewish Christians because they would be considered Jews. So they would be exiled out of Rome. So at this time, whether Aquila and Priscilla are Christians, we don't know. Scholars assume they may be, or either they're converted because they do become followers of Christ, as we'll see, as we'll talk about later. So as we go into the text, so they'd come there because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, Paul comes to him because he was of the same trade. He stayed with them, and they were working for by trade, they were tent makers. And he was restoring in the synagogue every Sabbath. He was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So kind of what was it that drew Paul to them? I'm sorry? Yeah, their trade, wasn't it? They were both tent makers. It was interesting when we saw that Dr. Manor referred to that area where tent makers would set up a shop somewhere. But why did why did Paul involve in his tent making? He had to eat. Yeah, Jim, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Yeah, we understand that. He had to eat. And that's the other good thing about him coming to Corinth. We'll talk about this a little bit more when Timothy comes, but he's probably broke. I mean, he's been traveling and he received some support from Antioch of Pisidia when he left. But, you know, he's been, this is the first time we've seen him pick up his trade and start to work because he's probably getting pretty destitute. With whatever families he stayed with, he'd stayed with Lydia. He'd received some help at that time, but he's kind of on his own. And here we see he's still on his own. So yeah, Jim, I think he had to eat and had to support himself. Now, as a rabbi, what was required of you as a rabbi? Remember, Paul was a trained up rabbi. What was one thing they were required to do? I'm sorry? They had to have a trade. And the idea was they wanted them to understand what real life was like. That was the ideas of the teaching. They needed to understand what real life was like. Alex? Back to Romans, you're talking about? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They had a lot of contention, didn't they? And you're saying that from the reason why Claudius would have expelled them, because they were always in contention, weren't they? A lot of times. So yeah, good point. There was a lot of contention that would be obviously spilled out into the public eye. And Claudius got to a point to where I'm tired of this. I want you all gone. And that's what he does. Now we're going to see here in a reference, and I think I've got it referenced on my slide. Yeah, I do on the next slide, that Priscilla and Aquila returned to Rome. So they don't think the exile lasted more than maybe a year and a half or 2 years, because in Romans, he's going to refer that Priscilla and Aquila are already back in Rome. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah, you can't win for losing, can you? And the other side about Paul, about working for himself, it was even, he didn't like to take support from the people where he was working at that time. And he writes extensively in Corinth about that, because he would not take money from the Corinthians. Now, if other churches would send him support, he would accept it. But he wanted to work for himself. He didn't want to take the money from the people he was teaching at that time, because it was used against him. And even in his writing in 2 Corinthians, there are those who accused him of not being a true apostle because he wouldn't accept their support. And said, you don't accept our support from Corinth because you must not really have anything, you feel guilty that you don't have anything of real value for us. So it worked against him. And he is always defending himself in that regard. Yes, ma'am? After Claudius died, that's when they came back. So they actually came back then. Thank you. Yeah. So they came back after Claudius died, which that gives it a good reason for their coming back. And so Priscilla and Aquila are going to go back to Rome. So Paul goes about his tent making to support himself. And we'll look at that as Timothy comes to him. He was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So he goes to the synagogue, which is his custom, and he's going to talk to the Jews and Greeks there as again as his custom. Other comments or thoughts about that? Yes, ma'am, Susan. Yeah, we're going to look at the passage that probably points directly to that. That when Timothy comes, that they probably bring him support. So yeah, that's a great point, because then he can get back to what he's intended to do, which we'll see that passage. Thanks, Susan. We're going to look at that. So here's a passage in Romans that tells us that Aquila and Priscilla are back in Rome because Paul sends greetings to them. And so we see that they do return. So let's look at verses 5 through 8, and we'll refer to that Susan mentioned. So when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, remember that's the province of Macedonia, which would include Philippians, Thessalonians, other places that Paul had been, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. This is what Susan's talking about. And look at a passage that gives us indication in 1 Thessalonians that when Timothy came, he probably brought, Timothy and Silas came, he may have brought some support with them to where Paul's either made enough from tent making, but probably received some support that he's able to go full time, completely devoting himself to the word. So he works when he needs to, but his goal is, I'm only working enough to be able to devote myself to completely teaching. And so now he's able to completely devote himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook off his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. The house of a man named Titius Justus, worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. So, what do you think it did for Paul when Silas and Timothy showed up? Probably raised his spirits, didn't it, John? Really probably was encouraging for him. And Steve? And that's a great point, Steve. And as we look at as we go further in our passage, we're going to see that Paul is actually afraid. And that may surprise us some. We're going to talk about that here in a minute as we have time. And Paul being by himself, but he's going to receive some other encouragement because Paul has been afraid. And it's going to come out in this text. So we're going to see that. And so, but yeah, this had to lift his spirits. Timothy and Silas had been sent off, and Paul's been by himself for some time, been by himself in Athens, and then he's back here in Corinth, and now they've joined him and probably have brought him some support, which we'll look at this passage in 1 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 7. Susan, is kind of what you were referring to, was giving us some indication that they probably brought some support. But now that Timothy has come to us, because he writes Thessalonians from Corinth, he writes this letter while Timothy's there, so Timothy can carry the letter back to the Thessalonians. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us just as we also long to see you. For this reason, brethren, in all our distresses and affliction, we are comforted about you through your faith. So Timothy has come to them and brought him good news about them, and so he's excited. He's excited to have them. Also, 2 Corinthians 11:9, he writes back to them, when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. Macedonia, remember, is in where Thessalonians is, and Philippians, where Thessalonica is, and Philippi. That's where Timothy and them come from, is Macedonia. So for when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need in everything. I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. So he writes back to the Corinthian church, I didn't take anything from you. When my brother came from Macedonia, they brought me the support I need. So I did not accept anything from you. So they can't pretend that Paul is teaching for financial gain. And he battles and defends his apostleship constantly through particularly the second letter to the Corinthians. So these passages really kind of attest to, Susan, what you're saying. Looks like they probably gave him the support. Now he could go back devoted to preaching the word, couldn't he? Other thoughts or comments in that regard? Okay. So back to our text. So what's the Jews' reaction to Paul's teaching? I'm sorry. Same as always, they resisted, didn't they? They resisted. They resisted to the point that Paul does what? Kind of shakes the dust off his feet. You know, your blood be on your heads. You know, that idea that we hear in Ezekiel about the watchman in the house of Israel. I have warned you about the danger to come. Now, it's not on me anymore. You've been warned. So the blood is on your head now. You know, I've done my duty to warn you and to teach. And so that idea from Ezekiel 33, 8 through 9 of the watchman who said, as long as you warn them, the blood will not be on your head. Mike? Yeah. They have to accept it, don't they, Mike? Exactly. Regardless of the results, you know, Paul continued to preach the message, and he wasn't apologetic for it. And so, so they reacted to the way to where he says he'll do what now? Now I'm going to the Gentiles. We've seen Paul do that before in his reaction. Now he's just meaning within that city. Now, when he goes to the next city, he's going to go back to the synagogue and start with the Jews. He's not saying he excluding ever teaching Jews again. It's from that city at that time. I'm going to the Gentiles now. So now he's going to concentrate his time on the Gentiles. But what's interesting about what does occur, now there's not a big reception from the Jews, but who does turn to Christ that would be significant? I'm sorry? The synagogue leader, Crispus, which was interesting. Crispus, because it's interesting. 1 Corinthians 1:14, Crispus is one of the few people who Paul actually baptizes. And he makes that reference in 1 Corinthians 1:14. But Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, leaves and is converted to Christ. And so, and this other member, so they get the image here, they left the synagogue and they went to the house of the man Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was what? Close to the synagogue. Now, can you imagine this? His house is close to the synagogue, and you've got the synagogue leader who's now probably going to Titius Justus's house to worship with those leaders. And you got these others that are centered around the synagogue, and it's probably pretty obvious of where he's gone and what's going on. They've lost the leader of the synagogue. Now, some synagogue would have maybe more than one leader, and we'll see that they appoint a leader quickly, and he's going to be referred to later too. But it's interesting that they could go next door to the synagogue and hear Paul preach, and the leader of the synagogue with him. So they could head towards the synagogue, but they could go next door or close by and hear Paul preach instead of going to the synagogue. So interesting dynamic there that happens among that group there. So let's look as time we have left. Any thoughts or comments about that part of the passage? Yes, Susan. Yeah, they seem to be more receptive, weren't they? We see that kind of holds true today, doesn't it? Do you have a comment over here? Thoughts, comments? Yeah, it really holds true today, doesn't it? And we hear Paul writes about not many noble, not many wise. You know, and we saw the struggles he had in Athens. That's a lesson for us. But here, let's look at this because this is really interesting. Talk about Paul and how much we've talked about, and obviously we admire the dedication that Paul has, but Paul had a human nature obviously about him as well. In Acts 9 through 11, and the Lord said to Paul in the night by vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, But go on speaking and do not be silent, for I'm with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. For I have many people in this city. And he settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So Paul has been afraid. Paul's been afraid. The Lord says, do not be afraid any longer. Continue to speak. What have we read about Paul and seen in his life that could cause Paul to have fear? He'd been through a lot of beatings, hadn't he? And arrest, and survived the stoning and other attempts on his life, which haven't ended yet, but there is a promise that he's given here. But yeah, don't you know, just of human nature, going through that would have some effect on you, wouldn't it? He really faced those physical dangers, and he really had those scars on his body. Can you imagine the scars that he must have had on his body from those beatings and the stonings? And I mean, so he was, and then he comes to Athens and he doesn't receive the receptivity that he hoped. And he was by himself. Steve mentioned he was by himself. How encouraging it is for Timothy and Silas come, but yet God comes to him because he knows that Paul in his spirit, he's been afraid. What's going to happen to me now? Because what's normally happened when the Jews have turned against him in the city, which they've just done here in Corinth, what normally happens after that? The beatings, the arrest. Here's where my trouble really comes. And that's in this text, in the context, that's what's just happened. The Jews have turned on him, and he's walked away from them. He's pulled their leader away. He's become a Christian. They're worshiping close to the synagogue. And so the next reaction is typically what's happened before is now the Jews build up this mob. They're going to run Paul out of town. And who knows what all else might happen to Paul. So I think it's natural for us to think or understand, being afraid, just being afraid for his own well-being. And so God understands that, understands his situation, and he comes to him in a vision. Now, this is interesting, and because Paul reflects back in Acts 26:16 that on the road to Damascus, the Lord told him, I'll come to you from time to time. And as we look at other passages, we'll see that Paul has these occasions where the Lord comes to him in a vision to encourage him in his work, in his work. Acts 26:16, Paul's talking about his conversion on the road to Damascus, but get up and, the Lord's speaking to him, but get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things in which I will appear to you. So we see here on one occasion, I can give you other references, in Acts 27, Acts 23, other references where Paul referenced that the Lord came to him. So he has been given encouragement from the Lord to carry on his work. Mike? Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Best encouragement he could receive, huh? Is the Lord coming to him and giving him, and he's going to give him a promise at this time. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. Okay, this is important. Now, he's not talking about forever, but he's saying while you're in Corinth, nobody's going to harm you. We're going to see that in the next lesson next week in this very chapter. That Paul, it looks like he's going to go through the same thing he's been through in the past, but he's going to escape unharmed because God's told him, no one is going to harm you, for I have many people in this city. God knows that I've got many people that are receptive. There's many people in this city that are receptive. And so he knows you will have more You'll have more fruitful labor here, I think is what he's telling him. There's more here. There's more, your family that you're going to gather here because, and you will not be harmed here. So he encourages to that extent, Mike, to where he understands where Paul's at. He understands the fear. He understands what Paul's had to face. Well, he's telling him, you know what? You're going to be safe here. No harm's going to fall you. And again, if you read the rest of the chapter, as it'll be looked at next week, really powerful how this is fulfilled. You know, you never know how long it takes for a fulfillment of a promise from God, but this one happens pretty quick in Paul's life there in Corinth. And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So he's there 1.5 years, and this is where he'll write the Thessalonian letter and sends Timothy to deliver it. And this is the last place. This is the last place that Silas is mentioned in Acts. In verse 5 we saw later. He's mentioned again in 2 Thessalonians 1:1, but we don't have much more dealings with Silas after this point. So any other thoughts or comments? I think last couple of scriptures we'll look at before we close this morning about Paul's fear. Listen to what he says to the Corinthians when he writes back to them about his state when he came there. He's telling them, this is what I was like when I got there. When I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. But Paul just pours his heart out to him, doesn't he? He said, this is my condition when I came to you. And so now we better understand when the Lord comes to Paul, he knew Paul was afraid. And Paul was going through this when he went to Corinth, and Paul writes back to the Corinthian church. Now, he was lonely. We talked about he may have been out of money. He went to work. He may have been ill. This idea of in weakness can also mean illness as well. Paul, we know, had health issues, the thorn in the flesh. We don't know what that was. But the Corinthians were apparently aware of his illness or his condition. 2 Corinthians 1:3-5, the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is abundant through Christ. So he knew the importance of being comforted in his sufferings. And past events had affected Paul. And so God had given him that encouragement in the vision that while he was in Corinth, he would not be harmed. So other thoughts, Glenda? Very discouraged. Kind of perked him up, didn't it? Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You just keep doing my work. There's more out there that's going to be receptive. And yeah, that's a great point. Steve, comment? I know. Yeah, exactly. To leave on his own decision. Yeah. So, but we'll pick up there and go through the rest of chapter 8. And it'd be interesting to see what occurs there in this next portion to where it seems like they want to try to do something to Paul, but we'll see how God is going to protect him. So next week, if you're reading along in the Truth for Today, it's pages 147 to 170, and it'll be the rest of Acts chapter 18. So thanks for all your good comments this morning and your kind attention.